troubles have appeared in Russia. Tensions between the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Wagner Group have ended up blowing up in the worst possible way for Russian interests. The Wagner Group, with Yevgeny Prigozhin at its head, rebelled against the Russian military leadership. But what has happened exactly? Why there has been this rebellion? What will happen now? Well, come on. Make yourself comfortable. We'll see it soon. The Wagner Group is a private military company that for the past few years has carried out the dirty work of the Russian government and Russian oligarchs. The issue is that when the war in Ukraine broke out, the Wagner Group was given a large amount of weaponry and the opportunity to recruit thousands of convicts from Russian prisons. In this way, the Wagners have gained a lot of military power. In fact, they have been practically the only ones capable of giving the Russian population some occasional victories in this war, such as the capture of Bakhmut. The head of the Wagner Group is Yevgeny Prigozhin, a businessman who has gained enormous popularity among the most ultra-nationalist sectors of Russia. The Wagners represent the most nationalist and pro-war branch of Russian society. As the conflict has progressed and escalated, the Russian Defense Ministry, on which the country's regular armed forces depend, has gradually seen how the Wagner Group had grown so much that it was beginning to be dangerous, since it was not subject to the authority of the Ministry of Defense, but was completely independent. To try to weaken the Wagner Group and prevent it from continuing to accumulate power, the Ministry of Defense began rationing the amount of ammunition he was assigning to Wagner, which led to very angry statements from Prigozhin and, most importantly, increased tension between Wagner and the Russian army. In fact, incidents between Wagner's mercenaries and Russian army soldiers have been relatively constant lately. Wagner were also prohibited from recruiting convicts into prisons. The latest move by the Russian Defense Ministry to weaken Wagner was to force all private military companies, including the Wagner Group, to sign a contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense, or, in other words, force the Wagners to place themselves under the orders of the Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, before July 1st, 2023. And as you can imagine, this was already the last straw. Since then, the outbursts of the leader of the Wagner Group against Defense Minister Shoigu and the commander-in-chief of the Russian troops in Ukraine, General Gerasimov, have been constant and very harsh. Prigozhin knew perfectly well that if he did not want to subordinate his company to the Ministry of Defense, he would have to do something before the 1st of July, and this was what finally happened, using a pretext that has not been confirmed, in which the leader of the Wagners claimed that his troops had been bombed by the Russian army. Prigozhin began his particular uprising by mobilizing his forces and taking them out of the Ukraine in the direction of Moscow. In the early hours of Saturday, June 24th, a movement began baptized as the Justice March. Despite the fact that it could be thought that the movement was improvised, U.S. intelligence has leaked that it knew about the Prigozhin movement in advance. And it is even speculated that Putin himself also knew it. Once Prigozhin recognized that his forces were on their way to Moscow, alarms went off all over the world. At that time, the question was, what support could the leader of the Wagner Group get? The triumph of the coup would require three fundamental pillars: the support of the civilian population, the support of Putin's entourage, and the heavyweights of Russian high society, and above all, the support that the Wagners could reap within the Russian armed forces. The faster and more determined was Wagner's movement, the more chances of victory. So Wagner's columns got down to work taking the city of Rostov-on-Don and the headquarters of the Southern Military District. The city fell with no resistance, and in Rostov you could see groups of civilians who took to the streets to support the action of the Wagner Group after the capture of Rostov. An appeal was made from the Russian ministry for the Wagner to lay down their arms. However, the Wagner forces continued on their way to Moscow, as the Wagner forces arrived at Voronezh and left it behind. Vladimir Putin was addressing the nation announcing plans to stop the Wagner Group, while Kazakhstan and Iran, Russia's theoretical allies, were putting themselves in profile and describing the events as an internal Russian issue. With this scenario, the Russian authorities began to order highways and roads to be blocked, digging ditches and placing trucks as obstacles to buy time while the defense of Moscow was prepared. At the same time, Russian helicopters unsuccessfully tried to destroy Wagner's columns. The problem is that the Wagners had taken anti-aircraft material and were able to shoot down 6 helicopters and a plane. At the same time, Kadyrov, leader of Chechnya, declared that he and his men remained loyal to Putin and were already on their way to fight against Wagner's mercenaries. The same was said by General Surovikin, who was faithful to the Putin's government, although some voices speculated that he could have been arrested. And that is how we reach the key moment in all this mess. a moment in which Wagner's forces are located 200 kilometers from Moscow, and in which it had been shown that Russia had very few reserves defending the capital. Well, at this moment we have to talk about Alexander Lukashenko, dictator of Belarus, who would have the key as a mediator in all this matter. But why? What does Lukashenko gain by mediating? Well, Lukashenko had a lot to lose. Without a strong Russia to defend him and embroiled in a potential civil war, Belarus might not have the ability to defend itself from an armed uprising by the opposition to Lukashenko. In fact, that same day, the Kastus Kalinowski regiment, made up of Belarusian opponents who are currently fighting in Ukraine against Russia. He published a medium in which he asked the Belarusian population opposed to Lukashenko to organize themselves and to be vigilant because the start of an armed uprising throughout the country was a matter of time. In this situation, Lukashenko got down to work to solve the problems of Russia, since Lukashenko himself has a very good relationship with both Putin and Prigozhin. By then, the situation was limited. Wagner's troops had entered the Moscow region, but very few political and military elements had committed themselves to the Wagner group. Prigozhin was alone. Shortly after, Prigozhin announced that Wagner's troops were going to turn around and withdraw from Rostov towards their bases. Details of the agreement are not yet known. Prigozhin appears to have been exiled to Belarus. The Wagner group will finally report to the Ministry of Defense. In exchange, the Russian government has decided not to file charges against the members of the Wagner group. What is still up in the air is whether the Minister of Defense and the Commander-in-Chief of the Russian armed forces in Ukraine, General Gerasimov, will continue in office because from the beginning there have been pools to see who their successors can be. Until now, little else is known, however. Everything that happens, I will tell you here in this channel. Fortunately for Russia, the problem was fixed quite soon, and it seems that the Russian forces on the front lines have not suffered too much. While there are still some questions in the air, did Wagner have any more support? Did Putin's government really know something? Will Prigozhin survive his exile? Well, see you in the comments. If you liked the video, please give it a like and subscribe. For the rest, a greeting and see you next time.